Hey everyone, how's it going? I know that you are certainly exhausted after having thought a lot about politics over the last week, but of course our course rolls on and we want to think in this particular learning module about this question of local political elections. And I know that many of you have certainly voted over the last few weeks in Maryland and in other states, and you've been thinking about some of these down ballot races that happen to appear in addition to the presidential election, which of course is everyone's attention. And I want to give you assurances that we will certainly be breaking down the presidential election in excruciating detail in our next synchronous learning module. But again, today, I think it's quite interesting actually to go under kind of that surface level result and start thinking also about some of the results from the 2020 presidential or general election, from the perspective of local politics. Because again, local politics are as important, if not more important, to the question of who gets what, when, why, and how in our local communities. And it can't be overstated that this is really on the ground how politics actually works for most people. And so when we think about the reading for this week, and certainly I encourage you to go through these couple of articles that I've put up on Blackboard this week, I think it's really interesting to compare some of our various voting models at the level of this local politics kind of experience. Because I think the ultimate question that I want to pose to you is, I'm going to show you, first of all, the results from the Democratic mayoral primary in Baltimore City, Maryland. We've got these candidates here, right? They all have D's next to their name. They all have names. At the end of the day, though, one of them won with 29.6% of the vote, 42,489 votes. Brandon Scott will be the next mayor of Baltimore, having also won the mayoral general election just a couple of days ago. And so what I want to think about, though, in this case is to, again, apply some of our theories that we've learned over the span of the semester to this election, not the presidential election, which is, of course, quite different, right? And if we go to the presidential election, we can see, right, we've got Dem, we've got GOP, we've got a couple other people here. But at the end of the day, these are extremely highly visible candidates. We've got an incumbent president. We've got a Democratic challenger who is extremely visible, who has spent $1 billion on a race. But if you come here, if we go back a few months and we think about this race, who is Lou Catelli? How is it that he received 151 votes for mayor in Baltimore? Who is Sheila Dixon? What's her story? Where do we know her from? Like, what is she about? Who is this Mary Miller? She got 15.6% of the vote. Has anybody ever heard of this person before? Right? Who's Keith Scott? There's a Brandon Scott and there's a Keith Scott. Who's TJ Smith? Right? Who are all these people? Thera Vignarajah, who's that guy? And of course, Bernard Jack Young, who received 6.2% of the vote in the Baltimore Democratic mayoral primary, he's actually the current incumbent mayor of Baltimore, which is, I think, a very interesting result here, actually, that Bernard Young got 6.2% of this entire vote. Who are these people? And I think I'm not asking you necessarily to tell me who they are, to go on Wikipedia or something. I think the more pivotal question here is, who do Baltimore City residents think these people are? And if we go back to our theories of voting, we can think about issue voting, we think about retrospective voting, right? Certainly there may have been some retrospective voting going on here in terms of the fact that this is the incumbent, right? There's an incumbency advantage that we often think gets baked into voting like this. But clearly, this looks nothing like the kinds of incumbency results that we might see elsewhere on the ballot. Like, for example, in some of these council districts, or in terms of our delegation to Congress. I'm not sure exactly where that is on this page. Let's see, maybe this is just Baltimore races. But of course we know that all 8 of our representatives were reelected to Congress in 2020 from Maryland. This is a very different picture here. And so again, if we think about this retrospective voting model, this seems a little bit suspect here. It seems like this is doing maybe a very poor job of explaining these particular splits. We can also think about the question of ideology, right? Like, do voters, again, know these people? Mary Miller, whoever that is, right? Of course, I know who Mary Miller is. Hopefully, some of you have heard of this person as well. Do they know Sheila Dixon? Do they know who these people are? And pivotally, right? Even though everybody here is a Democrat, are they able to discern what ideological differences exist between these candidates? And again, going back to some of our modules where we were thinking about the actual kind of sophistication of the American public, in these local races where not billions of dollars are being spent, but maybe thousands of dollars are being spent, is it really safe to assume that these voters understand that there is an ideological spectrum within this single Democratic Party primary that actually separates some of these candidates, right? Like Thiru Vignaraja has a much more sort of like law and order perspective on the issues than, say like a Sheila Dixon or somebody, right? Like, do they know the name of this person and the fact that they actually also used to be the mayor? Do they know that this is a random weird guy who rides a tricycle around the Hamden neighborhood? Right? Do they know, for example, who Ricky Vaughn is and her role in the Democratic Party, or T.J. Smith and his role in the Democratic Party of Maryland? These questions are outstanding. But at the end of the day, right, the not American public, but the Baltimore public was able to choose with a very small margin, right, 26.9 or 29.6 to 27.5, a candidate for the mayoral race. And so clearly there was some signal that was sent to voters where people were able to understand that Brandon Scott represented a party platform or a political platform that differed from some of these other candidates and that was preferred by the median Baltimore City voter. So what we're really thinking about here is this idea of spatial voting. That is, if we think about the average Baltimore voter and their ideological distance, or the perceived sort of distance between this candidate and that average person, we would make the assumption, essentially, that a lot of people perceived Brandon Scott to be close relatively to them in terms of his particular political ideology. But at the same time, those ideological preconceptions aren't necessarily the kinds of things that we're talking about generally in terms of a national level political kind of perspective. So like Brandon Scott's opinion on certain national level political concepts are not going to be very relevant to Baltimore City. Obviously, the issue agenda is going to be quite different. But so again, the question remains, though, that is it possible that people were able to think carefully about this decision and make a choice which reflected that ideological issue space, whatever that issue space is? We're going from a world in which, at the national level, when we go back to the national level, Marylanders were able to use very clear and effective cues to be able to understand this decision. They were able to figure out, okay, I know what a Democrat is, I know what the GOP is, I know something about Donald Trump having been the presidential incumbent and a highly visible person. I know generally who Joe Biden is, perhaps from his role as the vice president. I've seen a debate maybe, or maybe I've seen a clip of a debate. I've heard these people talk. I'm able to also make some assumptions about the ideological, essentially positions of these two people. I know that one is probably more conservative than the other, and the other is more liberal than the other, right? I don't know so much about these people, maybe, might say the average voter, but again, I know about the two parties and am able to differentiate between them on the basis of these simple cues. So even people with extremely low levels of political information are able to turn out and vote in record numbers, as we've seen, to make a choice between these two candidates. Here, that is not at all the same assumption. What we have here is an incredibly low information election where the cues that we might otherwise have don't exist. And of course, if we go to the 2020 Maryland election results, we see that nevertheless, these things make sense to us as political scientists. They make sense to us as people who study these populations, right? That this map isn't an accident, right? It's not, we would have, there's to put it this way, there's a reason why these states were called with 0% reporting and why these states were called with 0% reporting. Essentially because we can make inferences about essentially the ability of people to make informed choices that represent their ideological preferences. And we see that playing out in all these different cases, right? In the mayoral race in Baltimore City, we see this independent candidate, Bob Wallace, received a number of votes, right? Certainly a hefty number, about 1 in every 5 vote. But Brandon Scott was ultimately the winner of that mayoral election. Another reason why the primary election in this case is so incredibly important, because the primary is where ideological differences between likely Democrat winners in Baltimore City are played out, and why most of the money actually in this race is actually spent during this primary moment. And so again, when we go back to the reading, we can see that there is essentially some pretty substantial evidence in today's politics that, in fact, voters, even at this local level, are able to use heuristic cues, very basic, very simple kinds of minimal information, to be able to make reasonable choices about their local political candidates. And so as you go about your business this week and you think about this presidential election, go beyond the surface and think about some of the people who won election in your localities, in your municipalities. And think about how the average median voter in your particular municipality might have thought about these different races, and think about whether or not this person who eventually was elected as the winner, think about whether that person seems to make sense or to fit kind of the ideological predispositions of your communities. I think you'll find that more likely than not that these kinds of races, there actually is a very persuasive logic to them, despite the fact that the average voter has probably seen or heard many of these names approximately never in their lives. So again, I look forward to talking to you more about this kind of topic in the weeks to come. But also, I am certainly excited to break down that bigger presidential race with you when we meet for the next hour on Wednesday. So have a wonderful week, and I look forward to hearing from you at that time. See you later.